Reichman University.
De-influenced. It's time to set the record straight with Jana Hoffman and Amanda Yakubowicz.
Welcome to De-Influence, a show that explores the world behind the camera, the influencers who can affect our lives and the world in which they live. My name is Jonah Hoffman, and with me, as always, is Amanda Yakubowicz, and today we are joined by a very special guest. He's one of the biggest advocates for Jewish students on campus and protecting Jewish campus life. Shabbos Kestenbaum, welcome to the show.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Really, I know your journey, and you've talked about it a lot online, that you went from, voting for Bernie in 2020 to being a surrogate for the Trump campaign in 2024. Can you sort of talk to us about that journey? And obviously we know you're also still a registered Democrat. Are you still feeling connected to the party? Can you kind of tell us about that journey and how that went over the past 4 years?
Well, first of all, don't let me being a registered Democrat, don't hold that against me, okay? Nobody's perfect. So look, I always say I registered to vote as a Democrat the day I turned 18. I was at the 2016 Democratic Convention as a Bernie Sanders supporter. In fact, I voted for him twice. I marched for Black Lives Matter. I marched at the Supreme Court when Roe v. Wade was overturned. So I'm happy to compare my progressive credentials any day of the week. I'm happy to out-liberal anyone in the Orthodox community, although it's not really saying much. As Ronald Reagan said, I didn't abandon the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party abandoned me. So there are certain fundamental liberal policies that I still subscribe to. I believe in aggressive actions to combat climate change. I believe in a strong federal minimum wage. I believe to most extents a woman's right to choose her reproductive health. At the same time, though, I don't believe that we can talk about any of those issues if we're dead. I don't think that we can talk about those issues if you have 7 American hostages in Gaza, if Jewish American students on their college campuses are being physically assaulted. And after October 7th, I simply had a reprioritization of values, whereby issues pertaining to the American Jewish community were of paramount concern to me. And we went to the Biden administration for the better part of a year and a half. We went to the Kamala Harris presidential campaign, and we said, these are our issues. These are our concerns. At the very least, make time for us. Speak with us. I don't mean me because I wanted meetings in the White House. I meant because American Jewish students were facing real discrimination, and we wanted to look to our policymakers and elected officials and say, well, what are you going to do about it? And in the same way, the African American community is not taken for granted. They use their political leverage in order to receive political and electoral concessions. So too, I think the American Jewish community should do the same thing. And whether you love Trump, you hate Trump, the fact of the matter is 45% of New York Jewry voted for Trump, 44% of Pennsylvania Jewry voted for Trump, 42% of Ohio Jewry. That's a very good thing because it shows the Democratic Party. If you want to win elections, if you want to be successful in your campaign, you're going to have to take the Jewish vote seriously. And if you don't want to, that's your prerogative, but you're just not going to win elections anymore. I remember testifying in front of the House Judiciary Committee, and the ranking Democratic member, Jerry Nadler, fell asleep. I mean, literally, he put his arms back and he nodded off. I remember going to Chuck Schumer's office with other Jewish students and being lied to repeatedly that he would bring the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act to a floor vote, which of course he never did. I helped accompany President Trump to the grave of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Kamala Harris was invited, and she said no. So at a certain point, we American Jews have to stop being taken for granted. If political campaigns are not going to take us seriously, that is their prerogative, that is their choice, but we are simply not going to support them in response. And let me just say this, and I know I give long answers, so I apologize, but if the Democratic Party wants to regain the center, if they want to expel the anti-democratic, anti-American, and anti-Semitic forces within their party, if they want to take us seriously, then great, I'd be more than happy. In fact, I would want to go back to the party, but the way things stand now, I just do not see how we can revert back to a party that did not take us seriously.
Right. And just to really hop on, you mentioned that, Kamala should have visited the OHEL, something you've talked extensively about in the past. Do you think if Kamala and Trump had the same policies with anti-Semitism and especially the same support for the Jewish community, Trump, obviously, his daughter converted to Judaism and has Jewish grandchildren. I've met them. They're very nice people. Do you think that if she had the same policies with anti-Semitism, you would have any support for the GOP at all, or would you still be fully on the Democrat train?
Well, it's a little counterfactual, but it's an interesting question. I'd say this. I'm not interested in Democrat or Republican. I'm not so interested in liberal or conservative. I'm interested in practical policy solutions that would alleviate the concerns that I and many American Jewish students had. So if we had a presidential campaign run by competent Democrats that had, for example, a Jewish student speak at the Democratic Convention about anti-Semitism, that had a presidential nominee who was willing to meet with the American Jewish community, that was willing to take bold stances against a nuclear Iran, that was willing to hold college campuses accountable, that was willing to show our greatest ally, Israel, that we have their back, then certainly I'd be open to it. Because, as I said, I'm not really interested if there's a D or an R next to the person's name. What I'm interested is the legislation, the practical things they will do to help our community. And it was objectively the case that one candidate, Donald Trump, did those things, that had that concern, that shared those priorities. And there was another presidential campaign, Kamala Harris, that at best did not care, and at worst were practicing and were promoting policy prescriptions that would harm our community, that would do a disservice to the American Jewish community. So had she taken policy prescriptions that were more in line with President Trump, certainly I'd be a lot more open about supporting her.
Yeah, that's
So
very
do
fair.
you feel that Trump, like, that he's doing everything right, that he really satisfies the need that Jewish Americans have, or do you ever disagree with him in regards to these issues that directly affect? For example, we can talk about something topical, even though we don't know when this episode will be released. But yesterday, he did a very big announcement about Gaza. And if there's ever times that you disagree with Trump, will you also speak out against his policies in the Republican Party in regards to Jewish issues?
Sure, sure. I mean, during the presidential campaign, I was very open and vocal that there is a far right element within the Republican Party that is deeply anti-Semitic. I proudly do not share any platforms or any stages or any events with Tucker Carlson. I think Candace Owens is a tremendous danger, not just to the Jewish community, but to the American people. This is a woman who's clearly intellectually challenged and has a untapped hatred, seething hatred for the Jewish people. So I will continue to hold policymakers accountable for the promises that they make, whether that's a Democrat or a Republican. At the end of the day, though, at my speech at the Republican convention, I said that I wanted to support a president who would expel foreign students on a foreign visa who violate American law. That's not bigoted. That's not controversial. That's not Islamophobic. That's been American law for 50 years. We just never enforce it. And what did President Trump do just last week? He signed an executive order that, lo and behold, would do literally just that. I said during my speech at the Republican convention that we should withhold federal funds from anti-Semitic institutions of higher learning that have not only betrayed the Jewish people, but the American taxpayer. Lo and behold, that's what President Trump is actively doing. So thus far, as it pertains to the promises made for American Jews and the American Jewish community, I am more than elated because he has not just made promises and kept those promises, but he's actually gone above and beyond what he had campaigned on. The fact that we are now permanently out of the United Nations Human Rights Council, the fact that we have permanently frozen all of our funding to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, the fact that we are going to apply sanctions to the ICC, the fact that we are going to expel these foreign students, the fact that we're going to crack down on DEI, the fact that he was floating just yesterday American control of the Gaza Strip. I mean, this is above and beyond what any of us could have imagined or conceived as possible in practical American electoral politics. So I'm very, very happy and proud of the choices that I made to support President Trump.
Yeah.
100%. And so originally, were you pro DEI as a progressive, as a strong member of the Democratic Party? And would you say now that you're anti-DEI? Like, what do you think of Trump's executive order with his DEI policy?
Yeah, even when I was the bleeding heart liberal, I never supported DEI because DEI inherently is racist. What DEI says is you African Americans or you LGBTQ plus, you will never be able to succeed based on your own merit. You will never be able to get ahead based on the strengths and the talents of you as the individual. Therefore, we are going to artificially prop up the metrics and the ways in which you can succeed. We are going to lower standards. I can think of nothing more at best patronizing and at worst encouraging of racism, encouraging of prejudicial stances against minority groups and minority students on college campuses. So there is nothing to me as illiberal as diversity, equity, and inclusion because it does not judge individuals based on the content of their character, but exclusively their creed, their race, their sexual orientation, their identity, their ethnicity. And I truly do believe that in order for individuals to progress, in order for groups to progress, we have to stop alienating ourselves into boxes. So I do not simply consider myself to be someone who focuses on Jewish related issues. Because as I said in my speech, Jewish values are American values. American values are Jewish values. Israel to me does not exist in a vacuum. Israel is the foundation of American democracy, of liberal values, of Western civilization. That's why I support it. But DEI does not care about creating broad coalitions, broad allyship. It simply relegates and reinforces the idea that you will never be anything more than your racial identity. You will never be anything more than your sexual orientation. And we are going to lower standards and we are going to artificially boost your metrics of success because we never think you will be able to succeed on your own. So I was always against DEI as a progressive.
Me as well, not as a progressive. And at my school, by the way, they call it EDID, like equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. So I don't
Right.
know if
So
it's like
actually,
that in all of Canada, but that's like even worse.
at Harvard, one of the things they started doing is they don't call it DEI anymore. They call it DIB, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So they think they're really going to fool the Trump administration. We don't have DEI. What do you? We have DIB. But I mean,
Same thing.
it's just silly. It's a
Oh,
game of semantics.
Same thing, different
oh,
font.
I see that.
Yeah.
That's actually crazy. DIB. Wow, I've never heard of that one. So then do you think Jews break the DEI system or are we just excluded from the system? Because I've had a few debates about this at Hillel and like are do we break the system or are we just not allowed to be involved in the system?
We break the system and therefore we're not allowed to be in the system because historically the way that DEI has imagined itself is by if you're an oppressed group, if you have experienced some type of persecution or oppression or discrimination, you will not be able to succeed unless, as I said, we lower the standards. And then Judaism comes along and says, well, we've been oppressed, we've been persecuted, we've been discriminated, and we're not talking about hundreds and hundreds of years ago, although that's certainly true. We're talking about less than 80 years ago. I mean, there are people alive who still remember gas chambers and crematoriums and Auschwitz directly. And not only did we experience that persecution and oppression, unlike essentially any other minority group, but we're actually quite successful in spite of what we have faced as a people. American Jewry is perhaps the best example of that. We faced discrimination, but nevertheless, we did not allow that discrimination to define who we are. And we are our leaders. We are at the upper echelons of entertainment and the arts industry, at business and politics, law and medicine. I mean, you name it, American Jews have succeeded. And that is a direct result of not being defined by our ideological narratives. That is a result of not placating to our historic narrative of oppression and discrimination. And that does not work in the DEI model because the DEI model suggests quite explicitly that if you are oppressed or discriminated, you will not be able to succeed on your own. And so because we don't fit that model, we are simply excluded from it, which is why whether it was 4 babies or 40,000 babies who were killed on October 7th, as my classmates will tell you, it really doesn't matter because resistance is justified when people are occupied because everything falls through the rubric of oppressor and oppressed. And American Jews certainly have the misfortune of being mischaracterized as white because of our whiteness, because of our inherent privilege or supposed privilege, I should say. We can never act in self-defense. I mean, again, this is an argument being brought up in a very serious manner in the hallowed halls of higher education in the United States. And I remember it was quite disturbing, but I remember very clearly a few days after October 7th having a serious discussion with classmates of mine at Harvard. These are our classmates who marched in the Women's March in 2017, who are self-proclaimed abortion rights activists. I believe almost all of them voted, if what am I saying? All of them voted for Kamala Harris. And we had serious discussions as to whether the nails lodged in Jewish women by Hamas after October 7th constituted rape or not. I was of the opinion it did. They were of the opinion it did not, because again, it falls through the oppressor and oppressed rubric. And even though Jews have been oppressed, nevertheless, we have been characterized, we have been selected to remain in the oppressor prism. And that's why no matter what Israel does, it's never self-defense. That's why no matter what the Jewish people do, it's always from this perception of privilege.
And that's the thing is like, what are we going to do about this box that we've been put in? Because like it's I see it as a battle between Jews as voters and Jews as democratically engaged citizens, right? Like if Jews want to do what's best for them as voters, then they'll do what you're doing and they'll vote for the party that supports them. They'll make their identity a real electoral force for parties to consider. But at the same time, that could lead to like political isolation and it could lead to the lack of bipartisanship or multi-partisanship, depends if you're in Canada or America, But then the other option is being a strong Jewish voice within your party and trying to make it better and working to strengthen that support across the board so that we can see Israel and Jewish issues become a bipartisan or multi-partisan issue again. The question is, will that work? So are you of the opinion that we do fight for a seat at the table, or just go where we are welcomed?
It depends. So, from an American electoral political perspective, I don't think we need to fight for our role in the Democratic Party, because if we can relegate the Democratic Party to a point of nothingness, then who cares? I mean, the Democratic Party currently is out of power. They are irrelevant. In fact, they're arguably the most irrelevant today than they have been in the last 20, 30 years. So, if we can ally ourselves in a bipartisan fashion, great. But if not, so long as we are being represented by those in power, I don't actually think it's that big of a problem. I think it's also true with institutions of higher learning. I cannot tell you how many parents have told me after a talk or a panel, they'll come up to me and say, it is more important now than ever to send our kids to Harvard and Columbia and Penn and NYU. And I just find it such a laughable rationale. I cannot tell you how many billionaires and hedge fund managers and CEOs have come up to me and said, Shabbos, we don't want to hire Harvard grads and Columbia grads and Yale grads. Whether you like Donald Trump or hate Donald Trump, the day after Trump was reelected, Harvard professors canceled classes. They baked lemon squares for their students. They had free massages. They had story time with Marty. They had Sunshine the Puppet console students. This is America's most elite, most advanced institution of higher learning, pile of garbage. This is not something that is worthy of our time, worthy of our talents, worthy of our students and kids, worthy of our money. And to me, the election was a repudiation of the Ivy Leagues. It was a repudiation of this sense of moral intellectual bankruptcy. And the American people are migrating away from those institutions of higher learning to other places: Binghamton, Maryland, University of Austin, Texas A&M, Georgia Tech, University of Chicago. So to fight for places where it's just silly, where it is just silly. And I think so many parents are deluding themselves and saying, well, my kid is going to fight back. They're saying that to rationalize why it is they're sending their kids there. They don't actually believe that. I mean, there's so few American Jewish students right now who are fighting back. All of a sudden, we're going to have these thousands and thousands of young American Jews going to college campuses, and they're going to be so pro-Israel and so explicit about their narrative. It's simply not true. I mean, I hope I'm wrong, but I do not see the quantitative metrics to support that case. And I'll close by saying this. No one has ever come up to me and said, Shabbos, we need to send our kids to RCC, Rockland Community College. Because Rockland Community College had encampments. Rockland Community College has anti-Semitic professors. Rockland Community College had swastikas being drawn. But no parent has ever said we need to send our kids to Rockland Community College now more than ever. Why? Because who cares what Rockland Community College does? I mean, no offense to any RCC alum who are watching, but ultimately their imprint on the national conversation, on the American political process is negligible. So I'm trying to create a movement, and I'm trying to shift the Jewish community's attitudes towards one whereby, just like we don't care what Rockland Community College is doing, we should not care what Harvard is doing and Penn is doing and Yale is doing and NYU is doing. I recognize this is not a short-term solution. This is long-term, but ultimately stop sending your kids to places where at best they are not wanted. And at worst, all of the values you have raised them with, all of the love of Israel and education and Jewish values will be scorned, will be humiliated, will be denigrated. It's just not worth it. And as I said, the American people have already recognized that. It's time for the Jewish community to recognize that as well.
And that's one thing about the Trump election that recently happened, and you could even call it a revolution in some sense, or the start of one, is that, the Jews know something that the rest of the world doesn't, whether it's kind of the BS of the Ivy Leagues or the international community, the shady things going on in the UN, et cetera. And what's interesting is that Trump and, slowly his supporters as well are starting to see it too.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very proud of that and happy for it.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny that you mentioned Jews knowing things before, the rest of the world seems to. It's one of many anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And a lot of these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories were taught in DEI and also CRT, critical race theory training, which is basically this extension, this arm of DEI that we saw a lot of in high schools, especially where I'm from in Seattle. There was headline after headline after headline of CRT being taught. And I know one of the terms of your lawsuit is anti-Semitism training. This relates to DEI. This relates to all of that. Can you go into detail and will it actually do anything by teaching anti-Semitism training, or is it just like another thing that we're taking a step to, but won't necessarily do anything?
I mean, yes and no. In an ideal world, should there be any type of anti-discrimination training? I'm not sure. The reality is, though, Harvard has pretty comprehensive anti-discrimination training, and that's not going anywhere. They're going to have that for a very, very long time. So my attitude is, so long as that module is in effect and mandatory for all incoming students, you might as well include anti-Semitism in it. And what a damning indictment on the state of higher education that in order for Jewish students to receive equity, equality, justice, we have to resort to a court of law. We have to mandate these things. If Harvard had a brain, they would have done this years ago, but of course they don't. So it requires Jewish students to sue them in the federal district court in Massachusetts and hope that the judge has enough sympathy whereby he recognizes the absolute double standards. In terms of the actual imprint that anti-Semitism training will have, that anti-discrimination training will have on incoming students, there's no way statistically and objectively to measure that because, of course, it hasn't happened yet. What I will say is this. I mean, it's a line I say a lot. When I'm not suing Harvard, I study the Holocaust and I track Holocaust education. Does it succeed in its efforts? And so often, especially in the Jewish nonprofit world, we have described Holocaust education and training pertaining to the Holocaust as a way to combat anti-Semitism, as a way to dispel hate. But the reality is, as Professor Ruth Wise mentions, as the author Dara Horn mentions, anti-Semitism has gone up almost in tandem with increased and mandatory Holocaust education bills. So if the point of Holocaust education is to deter anti-Semitism, is to combat hate, if that is your sole metric of success, then objectively speaking, it doesn't work. I believe in Holocaust education, but not really because it's a tool to combat anti-Semitism. I don't actually think it is. So what are the goals of anti-discrimination training that is mandatory for incoming students at Harvard and at all these other institutions? I don't know what their stated purpose is, and I do think there's a good conversation to be had as, are they effective? And I'll say this one last point just because it popped into my head now. 2-3 months before October 7th, there was a replica Auschwitz cattle car that was brought onto Harvard's campus. And I remember former president, actually, he was the interim president at the time, I believe, Larry Bacow, talking about the importance of having this cattle car at Harvard so people can see this and they will combat hate in all of its forms, that they will be sensitive to anti-Semitism. This is, 2-3 months before October 7th. We brought a replica Auschwitz cattle car. You can't get more Holocaust education-y than that. Did it
Uh,
work?
yeah,
I'll let the narrative of the last year and a half speak for itself.
right.
A
And
lot of
just to,
campuses do the cattle car, and like I don't know. I remember when I saw it on my campus a couple years ago, and it just I don't know. Maybe that was my perspective as a Jewish student, but I that's not shock value is not necessarily the thing that's going to be the most educational for people that have no connection to the Holocaust.
Mhm.
I always say this internally as a Jewish community, the way that we combat anti-Semitism and stop this hate is investing massively and radically in Jewish education, making sure that there is not an American Jew today who's going to public school because their parents can't afford yeshiva tuition, that there is no American Jew today who does not know where their nearest Chabad house is, who does not know what summer camp opportunities are available for them. And then externally, outside of the Jewish community, the only practical way to fight anti-Semitism and the only way that will actually have an effect is by prosecuting crime. I mean, that's literally it. You do not need to go to another Holocaust museum. And again, I studied the Holocaust. I'm in favor of Holocaust museums, but stop sending people there. Number one, it gives them good ideas. And number two, it's simply ineffective. And if the American government, especially under the Biden administration, were to simply take that approach from day one, you would not see the riots on our college campuses. You would not have seen the blocking of synagogues in LA. You would not see the blatant hatred on the subways of New York. And I'll close by saying this anecdote. When the Adas Torah synagogue in Los Angeles was being protested against, and you had masked rioters outside preventing Jews from entering the building, Joe Biden wrote on Twitter either that night or the following day saying, "We condemn that this happened. It's just so terrible." And I agree. It is just so terrible. But at the end of the day, Joe Biden was in charge of the Department of Justice, which has a hate crimes task force. All Joe Biden needed to do was say, we are going to prosecute every single one of those assholes with their masks and keffiyehs who prevented Jews from worshiping inside their synagogues and exercising their First Amendment rights. That would have prevented this from happening again. But of course, our elected policymakers never take that approach.
Right. And crime and policing is at the end of the day what can make or break policy and also what can really help the Jewish community in the best way. And really just to continue on the campus points that we've been talking about, what are the actual dangers of being Jewish on campus? Because we talked a lot about separate incidents and stuff, and it's a very big thing on social media, especially. Is it as dangerous as it seems to be on social media from an outside perspective? I study in Israel, so I don't, thank God, Baruch Hashem, I don't experience a lot of this, but I understand most Jews study in the United States and Europe and elsewhere. Is it as dangerous as it seems on social media, or is it actually like not as bad?
So yes and no. I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but I'll just give you some anecdotes. This past semester at Harvard, a Jewish freshman hung up a mezuzah by her dorm, and then the next day it was stolen. I remember speaking at the University of Pittsburgh to the Jewish students there, and as I am speaking, they get an alert from campus police that a Jewish student was physically assaulted. That was the third physical assault against a Jewish student at the University of Pittsburgh that month alone. I have friends at Columbia who have been on the receiving end of death threats, who've been stalked back to their dorm room. I have friends at UCLA who've been also physically assaulted on their campus during the encampments. So are there campuses that are better off than others? Absolutely. Are campuses as a whole incubators of the hate and the indoctrination and the blatant anti-Semitism? Not all. I mean, I happen to be a fan of a lot of universities. Just most of them that I don't like, I talk about more often. So all campuses are different, but what we are seeing is especially the quote unquote elite ones, or really the expensive ones. That's how Congress refers to them. Elite is just code word for expensive. We are seeing that it's more of a prevalent issue, that it's more pronounced there. But I don't want to cast aspersions on all college campuses in the United States, and I'm not trying to dissuade American Jews from going where they want to. What I am trying to do is create a relatively compelling case as to the necessity to abandon spaces that do not deserve the talents of the American Jewish community and that have betrayed the American people. That's what I'm trying to do.
And so that's the thing with like what's happening on campus right now and looking at the production value of these encampments, for lack of a better word. Um, and like I see what you do, I see what so many of my friends do, and just throughout North America and even throughout the world, the way that Jews are standing up on campuses. But at the same time, I have this voice at the back of my head that's saying, like, is it worth putting a target on my back, being this little campus activist warrior? If there's all this foreign funding that's coming in, there's so much indoctrination coming in, Qatari funding, whatever you want. And it's embedding in our universities, and it's been embedding there and growing for the past 20 years. And sometimes I'm like, is this ever even going to do anything, or is there no use?
So yes and no. First of all, it's important to emphasize that what I'm doing and what a significant amount of Jewish students across college campuses are doing is not really combating anti-Semitism or fighting hate. Because as I said, I don't particularly care about idiots on campuses drawing swastikas. I don't care about their river to the sea. I care that the universities and those in positions of leadership have a blatant double standard. I care that they are blatantly anti-Semitic, and that's where the lawsuits come into play. That's where the court of law and the court of public opinion come into play. But if I was simply waking up each day and fighting other people, number one is, as you said, it's a very demoralizing effort. What I do see myself doing, and what I do think many, many, many Jewish students on college campuses are doing, is fighting for something, is fighting for the American Jewish story, is fighting for the land of Israel, is fighting for American democracy and liberal values. That is way more of an encouraging fight, and that is way more of a necessity. So in terms of should I battle my college campus, I think that's just the wrong method of looking at it. It's the wrong attitude to take. Don't see yourself as fighting against something. See yourself as fighting for something. And I think you'll actually find a lot more success if you take that approach. I would also add, when I started doing this, and I'm saying the word this in a very general way, I didn't know what would happen. I did not know what it would lead to. I was not even planning on filing any litigation against the university. One thing sort of led to the next. I did not have a 5-year plan or a master strategy. I simply felt that what was happening on my campus in particular was outrageous, and I wanted to stand up for my community. And lo and behold, I guess it had some degree of output and some degree of success. And if I can do it, then anyone listening can do it just as well, if not a heck of a lot better, because I did it with really out any institutional support, without the help of the Jewish nonprofit space, without a strong coalition on campus who were supporting what we were doing. And as I said, I don't want to say I was successful, but I was a lot more successful than I could have ever conceived of. So there's no reason why American Jews on their respective campuses can't do the exact same thing.
And so you mentioned nonprofits, and that's a very good transition into our next question. But also, I just have to mention, like you said, everyone can do it, but we're really, really appreciative of the fact that someone so eloquent and articulate like you is doing it. And just like, thank you for being in this space. Thank you for being part of all of this social media sphere and activism sphere, because really, like, a voice like yours is so needed, just the communication aspect of it. But yeah, going back to Jewish nonprofits. So, okay, Hillel, but also other ones. So I know at some point you posted about Hillel, how there's political disagreements, and some university, I forgot which one, disinvited you or something. But overall, how has your experience been with Jewish campus organizations, Jewish nonprofits in this time since October 7th? And yeah, do you feel that because that's a big topic in our podcast, and like the thesis of our podcast as a whole is the priorities of the Jewish community and the pro-Israel community post October 7th in this sphere. Um, and so are the priorities in the right places? Is the money going to the right places? How's your experience been?
This is the question that always gets me into the most trouble. So I'll tread very carefully. Hill International is very proud and public of the fact that in the last year they've raised $200 million. The Jewish Federations of North America, I was on panel with Eric Fingerhurt, are very proud of the fact that they've raised close to $1 billion since October 7th. The Anti-Defamation League is very proud of the fact that they organized a really high-end concert with some of the biggest stars in the entertainment industry. And I receive texts almost daily from Jewish students saying that they are struggling to raise $500 to do a table event on campus. They're struggling to raise $1,000 to bring in a speaker. They're struggling to receive responses from Jewish organizations that, in theory or on paper, are meant to be elevating and amplifying their concerns. So I do not, for the life of me, understand why we young Jews are not allowed to talk about the obvious failings of the adults in the room, of the leadership who purport to be the ones combating anti-Semitism, protecting the American Jewish community, being at the forefront for political and legislative change. And you look at what happened on our campuses on October 7th and the absence of leadership. I think we need to have that conversation. But again, every time I bring it up, I'm disinvited from another panel or I'm disinvited from speaking there. So we're not allowed to talk about it for whatever reason. I think there should be a public inquiry in Israel as to how October 7th was allowed to happen. And I think there should be a public inquiry as to how the Jewish nonprofits have responded or not to the events of October 7th and how they were able or not able to prevent this onslaught of hate. The fact that we couldn't even get the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act passed in the House, passed in the Senate, considering how much the Jewish nonprofit space purports to have access to policymakers, the fact that our campuses are Hitler Youth rallies. But again, we're not allowed to bring up these conversations. And every time I do, I immediately receive responses from members of the board of trustees for that organization, the CEO of this organization, saying, how dare you try to create disunity at a time where we need to be more united now than ever. So to me, the obvious future of the American Jewish community is young Jews on campuses. They're the ones who are fighting. They're the ones creating change. They are the ones who are amplifying the problems within the community. And that has been incredibly important. That has been very comforting to know that it is young American Jews who are taking the future into their own hands. They're not waiting around for the Jewish nonprofits and their billions of dollars to help because, and they're kind of right, they don't really see help coming. And I will leave it at that because if I get into more specifics, I will be disinvited from even more conferences and I have to pay my rent somehow.
Yeah.
See, this is the inspiration I just got. Jonah, what do you think? We got Shabbos, we got another episode, Shabbos on the pod, like CEO of Hillel or someone really high up on Hillel, and just 40 minutes of this
Maybe
fighting.
I'll get him and Jonathan Greenblatt up here to debate each other. I think that could be pretty fun.
That's
Well, let
good.
me let me add. Jonathan is a good guy. I don't know if I'd say friends, but very friendly. He's come on Harvard's campus a few times. I have nothing against these individuals. I do not have a vendetta.
Hmm.
What I would like to know is, of the hundreds of millions of dollars you have raised since October 7th, what have you done with the money? What are you going to do to help American Jews on college campuses? That is what I'm concerned about. And I would like all of these organizations to succeed. The AJC, the ADL, Hillel International, I would like all of them to succeed. And in order for them to succeed, they need constructive feedback, especially from the people who are at the tail end, or the front end, I should say, of experiencing this onslaught of hate firsthand. And to me, that seems quite reasonable. But to many nonprofits, that is considered an attack, and they will not hear of it.
Awesome. With that said, we're excited to see what you do at the ballot box in 2028. I think we're all looking forward to that. Thank you so much for listening to De-Influence, the show that sets the record straight, explores the world of influencers, content creators, and more. Thank you so much, Shabbos, for joining us today. My name is Jonah,
Thank
and
you
with me, as
so
always, is
much,
Amanda.
Travis.
Thank you so much, and we'll see you in the next one.
De-Influenced. It's time to set the record straight.